and we are most appreciative. So as everybody knows, we're going to talk about your brilliant TV career and fabulously name-dropping memories of your life in broadcasting. So you're a TV producer, journalist, writer, and much appreciated member of Muswell Hill Synagogue. You're going to share funny stories and anecdotes about your life in TV, the presenters you work with, most recently including Rip-Off Britain Holidays, reflections, even going as far as maybe some reflections on presenters' pay and behavior. So you've got a slide presentation you're going to give. Now, in introducing you, I just wanted to say that the big thing is that you've just written your first book, Reparation, and it's been shortlisted for the Paul Torday Memorial Prize. So that's really exciting. Some people like me may not know much about it, but what you explained to me was you talked about the book for the Top of the Hill group, and so you thought maybe people would like something different tonight. So you're going to start with talking about your career in broadcasting, but as you explained, you're very excited about writing and you're happy to talk about it. You're a passionate believer in the idea that it's never too late to start writing fiction. And you've written for the JC and for lots of other national papers and magazines. So maybe we'll touch on that aspect of things afterwards. I'll just say then, looking up something about you, which I don't know much about you actually. So I did see that you grew up in Cardiff. And one thing I found interesting is that your parents decided to join the local Reform synagogue, mainly because it was made up of continental refugees, whereas the Orthodox synagogue in Cardiff was made up of very English Jews. So that's how you started. I hope that's correct. You can clarify everything. And you went to the University of Sussex, where you studied filmmaking. And the other thing
English.
Pardon?
English. I studied English.
English, not filmmaking. Okay, English, scratch that out. And the other thing I didn't know about you, which I'm so impressed with, I hope this is correct, is that in 2001, you staged the first ever Holocaust Memorial Day event.
I did.
Which is amazing. So you're the person to thank for all that.
Well, I think there's a certain MP who put an act through the House of Parliament should take the credit, but I just ended up holding the baton.
Well, fantastic, thank you. So I was very interested to read about the novel and how there's various things that touch on your awareness of trauma from the Holocaust being carried down through the generations. So maybe we'll talk about that later. We'll see how the time goes. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much to do your slide presentation. And then later on, people will ask questions, maybe just wave and then unmute yourself. And that way it'll stay all calm and everybody won't talk at once. So thanks a great deal. Over to you.
Right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. And what I thought I'd do today is talk about my TV experiences, which, not that I've risen to any great senior level in TV, you know, there are many of my peer group who've gone much further, but I've had fun. And I thought what I'd do today is take a bit of a walk down memory lane. And whenever I say I work in TV, of course, one thing that people always say, ooh, have you ever met anybody famous? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. It's fairly inevitable that you do meet and work with people who are in the public eye, and some of them are nicer than others. All will be revealed. So I'm going to try and share my slideshow, as I said. Share.
We would go to speaker view if not already on it. Great.
Right. So I don't know if you can see full screen. My brilliant. That's it. So. I promised you some name dropping, so let's start as I mean to continue. And so some of the people I've worked with in the past, Vanessa, of course, went to New York with her, Eamon, Carol Vorderman, the lovely Carol. But slightly more seriously, I do want to raise a few questions about television. You know, I mean, people always, you know, say to me, I mean, famously, somebody said to me in the middle of a shiver, how can a nice Jewish girl like you work for the BBC? Which I took a bit personally, because actually my parents thought they'd never let me in because I was Jewish, and they thought there was a numerus clausus, as they would have put it. Actually, you know, I regarded it as a huge achievement when I got my first job in 1983. So I'd like, you know, there are issues obviously surrounding the BBC, and everybody has got an opinion about the BBC, which has been my main employer, although I've also worked for Channel 4 and other stations too. But so I'd love you to ask me questions afterwards, and hopefully I won't bore you on too long with a few little recollections of my time in TV. So I'm going to start by putting the clock back to 1983. I was 25, and can you see that? Because I've got, okay, that's me, age 25, a fresh-faced cub reporter straight from local newspapers, the Hastings and St Leonard's Observer, when I first entered the hallowed portals of the BBC. Unfortunately, it wasn't the corporation's iconic television centre, or even John Reith's magnificent building in Portland Place, but the slightly more modest Yorkshire headquarters on Leeds' Woodhouse Lane. I was the latest recruit to the popular nightly magazine show that some people will remember, Nationwide, which was fronted by Sue Lawley, Hugh Scully and Frank Boff. Although I think actually Frank had already left to work on the new Breakfast Time show that had recently launched. And I was about to have a very rude awakening to the realities of regional telly. So from what I'd seen on screen, I expected that I'd be joining a large team and would be able to hide my total ignorance of the medium by sitting at the back and copying the others. Arriving punctually, dressed neatly, I was whisked into the boss's office for what promised to be a cosy welcome chat. It wasn't. Leaning back in his chair, a man with grey hair and a cable knit cardigan said, "This is BBC North. We are the regional representatives of the television news, and our first responsibility is to serve them. We also put out a nightly television programme called Look North. That is our second priority. You, Nationwide, are third and last. Never forget that. I don't want to hear about you getting in the way of my staff." And with that, he showed me to my seat in the darkest corner of the newsroom and left me there saying, "You better call London." And that is how I learned that I was the sole representative of Nationwide in Leeds. There was a phone on my desk, but no numbers, no list of numbers. And after a few minutes, Brian, the genteel continuity announcer, who was sitting opposite me, looked sympathetically at me and whispered something about the circuit, without explaining what it was. So more time passed, and somebody brought to my desk a small contraption. It could have been designed by Heath Robinson. It was like an aluminium box with a speaker and a switch attached to a set of Bakelite headphones by a cloth covered cable. I mean, it was looked like something out of Bletchley Park. So I put on the headset and I could hear disembodied voices, and this was the famous circuit. So what I could actually hear was editors in London talking to other researchers in other regions, including Steve in Manchester, Bob in Bristol, Tina in Norwich, and Alison in Birmingham. And remember that name because it's going to come back later. So they were all sort of discussing different contributions, different stories from the regions. And finally, it sounded as though everybody was about to go home. So I just summoned up the courage and pressed my button and went, "It's Gaby in Leeds." And there was silence. And then even more worryingly, it was a, "Hi, Gaby, welcome. We'll want something from you on the Cod Wars. Speak in a minute." Panic. All I could think is that we are in the middle of the country. I don't even know where the nearest seaport is. What are they on? But as soon as the circuit finished, I rushed over. There was a huge map on the wall, and I discovered that if you can see the right-hand side of this map, we were in the Yorkshire region, and of course Hull and Grimsby were part of the region. And so, armed with this very vital information, I sat by my phone and waited for the rest of the day, but the phone never rang. It was an exhausting day doing virtually nothing, but I'd actually learned quite a lot. And the following morning, I waited for the circuit. I didn't say anything apart from, hello, it's Gaby here in Leeds. But I listened and I took copious notes. And one of the forward planning stories was strong on human interest, just the kind of social issue I was interested in. It was about something called, that was then, I think the phrase has gone out of use, granny bashing, by, you know, where frazzled carers and family members sort of lose their tempers and abuse elderly people they're caring for. And luckily, my journalism training kicked in. I got on the phone to all the branches of age concern in the area. And by the end of the day, I had a solid case history of a woman caring for a mother suffering from early onset dementia who was willing to talk about feeling close to the edge. And she would say on camera that she felt like hitting her mother. And if it wasn't for the respite care and the support of age concern, she would have done so, in fact. So I rang the producer who'd been asking for the contribution, managed to find a number, got through, and she told me that she would like me to make a 1-minute film about the woman. And I don't know if anybody remembers Nationwide, but they had all these like little 1-minute inserts. And hooray, I was absolutely ecstatic. And then she uttered the immortal line, Gaby, have you ever directed a film before? And I just didn't know what to say. I mean, to me, film director, it was just so far from what I thought I'd be doing. I thought film directors were people like John Ford and Francis Ford Coppola, and none of my names featured the word Ford in it. So it wasn't even an aspiration. It wasn't a dream. I just wanted to sit at the back and copy the others. And I just went, no. And she went, okay, no probs. I'll tell you what to do. Oh, great. Okay. So I thought I'd get a pencil. Yeah. And, you know, I was here, you know, I was a humble hack and poised to work out how to create a memorable piece of visual communication. And my pen was poised, and she went, get lots of cutaways. And I wrote that down, yeah. And I said, well, what else? And she said, yeah, get lots of cutaways. Don't bother to ask what they are. Just make sure he gets lots. So I went off with the crew. And in fact, that did turn out to be the best bit of advice I'd ever received. And my 1-minute masterpiece hit the air 2 nights later. And I'd gone from 0 to hero by the end of my first week in telly. So promptly, I mean, in the days before email, we had something called internal mail. So I got a herogram from this bloke, Roger Bolton. Some of you probably listen to him on Radio 4 now. He gave me my first job in television. I owe everything to this man. And he was very good at that, looking after you and just making sure you knew you were appreciated. So I stayed on Nationwide for 6 months, and then it was replaced by an unlamented programme called 60 Minutes, and went from then to Breakfast Time, which some of you will remember these faces and that logo. And by now I was a fully fledged, I moved to Thames Television, which was, you know, the commercial sector. And by now I was a fully fledged film director, but that's Penny Juna. Here's me on location. So that's in Copenhagen, actually. So that's the slightly younger me directing a crew in Copenhagen. And some of you will remember that Thames actually lost the franchise very dramatically in 1991. It's a bit of political history, which is writ large for me, but probably not so big for everybody else, because I lost my job when I was 8 months pregnant. They had made a programme called Death on the Rock, which produced by my old mate Roger Bolton and researched by a woman I will always know as Alison from Birmingham, mentioned earlier. That's not it. I'm sort of going to have to go back one. So, sorry, I've got my slides in slightly the wrong order, but I'll just carry on. So anyway, it was claimed that some IRA members shot by the SAS in Gibraltar were actually shot in cold blood when they posed no harm and could have been simply arrested. And to be honest, people are arguing the toss about that 30 years later. But either way, Thames lost the franchise, and I was 8 months pregnant, out of a job, and we'd mortgaged ourselves to the hilt to buy a derelict Victorian pile in Hackney, where we still live. Luckily, we didn't lose it, but it was touch and go because the mortgage rate was 15%. Happy days. just a bit of Jewish gossip about Alison, the aforementioned Alison Kahn, whose picture is going to emerge in a minute in my slightly disarrayed sequence, is that her father was Professor Robert Wolfgang Kahn, who was a German refugee. And so she was a very good friend when we worked together. So when I was working for Thames, I was working on a programme called For What It's Worth, which was a consumer programme a bit like Watchdog. And I don't know if you can see this. It is a TV Times from the 20th to the 26th of February 1988. And down here it says For What It's Worth. And there you see, presented by Penny Junior, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there I am. Up the ranks, researcher, assistant producer, producer, and series producer. I moved back to the BBC in 1993 or so, and in fact, I then worked on a not dissimilar programme. Oh, sorry, just found Alison Kahn with Anne Robinson and Alice Beer. Watchdog, found the old logo for that. I mean, obviously that's a programme that's still on our screens, but I've also worked on other programmes. Judith mentioned Holocaust Memorial Day, and there was Crime Watch UK, and this one. Now, interestingly today, so this is the experiment which we did in 91-2, where we recreated a classic psychology experiment. We built a prison at Elstree, and interestingly, Steve Reicher, who was one of the psychologists, on-screen psychologists in this series, has been all over the news today because he is a government advisor. And he has been tweeting about Dominic Cummings, and I just listened to him on the on PM programme. So I promised some chit-chat about presenters, and so I have worked with a lot of fabulous people, and I've mentioned Carol Vorderman, and she, to me, is one of the best presenters I've ever worked with, because when I was running late on a shoot, she said to me, I'm just going to cancel the event I was going to tonight. Don't worry about it. I've got my laptop and my phone. I'll be in my dressing room. Just call when you want me. And I have to stress that kind of behaviour is very, very unusual. I mean, I've had presenters keeping a whole outside broadcast team of 30 waiting 2 hours because he didn't feel like coming out of his house. I've had a presenter scream at me that she's going to be leaving the set at 6 p.m. on the dot to go to a film premiere, when the only reason we were running late was because she was taking an unscheduled holiday and we had twice the amount of work to do in that day. And, you know, this is the thing where which you do see in the press a lot about presenter pay. The BBC execs who were my bosses on that occasion didn't have the guts to confront my presenter and to say, you're taking a holiday, which is, breaking the terms of your contract. They just went along with it and let me pick up the pieces.
חברות התעופה חוזרות.
Can you hear a bit of...
Jackie, can you please mute
airline
yourself?
companies return to flying. חברות תעופה בעולם מתכוננות.
Jackie, please mute yourself.
I can't hear you now, Judith.
Sorry, I think you're okay to carry on.
So what I was going to say is the system that we have makes monsters, really. And, I think a presenter who gets paid a huge amount of money for very little work, and often, a presenter can get paid in a day what one of our researchers earns in a year. And so they'd have to be superhuman for that not to go to their head in some way. And some of them who are mature and have self-knowledge do carry it off. And, you know, some of them, I mean, my absolute dream team, and I know that Adrian Charles has got his detractors and there was a lot of fuss about him, but he is every producer's dream ticket for me. He was, you know, such a gent, and it, you know, the money didn't, to me, it appeared the money didn't matter to him. So the other thing I would say is the team that I work with at the moment, Gloria Hunniford sends a crate of wine to Salford every Christmas to be distributed amongst the production team. And that is rare. And it's much appreciated. You know, it's not a vintage wine. It's a bottle of wine that shows that she appreciates what we do. Because, you know, television is a team game, and it's no presenter gets there by themselves. They are only as good as the production team they work with. And for them not to understand that just shows ignorance to me. However, that is the producer's point of view. I mean, when I was an assistant producer on Breakfast Time, of course, we did have all sorts of guests. It was Celebrities A Go-Go. The one I didn't expect to like, but absolutely thought was amazing, was Jeffrey Archer, the former Olympian and novelist. And he was then the deputy chairman of the Tory party, so probably not on my wavelength politically. And he arrived full of beans at 6 a.m. and went, "Good morning, ladies of the makeup room." And he spoke to everybody as an individual and spoke to everybody, not just, you know, the sort of the presenters and the people he thought were important, which was a real wake-up call to me. My biggest disappointment was Dennis Waterman, then starring in Minder, clearly not a morning person. And the biggest embarrassment was Daniel Day-Lewis, who wasn't a very big name at the time. He came on to talk about his latest film, which was Room with a View, and our shifts were 9 p.m. till 9:30 the following morning, which I used to find absolutely draining. I don't know if anybody here has done night shifts, but I used to arrive, you know, when the programme started by 6 o'clock, I was absolutely in pieces. And it was back in the day when we had those long computer printouts, big continuous sheets. And I stumbled down to reception to greet the incredibly handsome Daniel Day-Lewis. I'm feeling like a complete mess. And reading from somewhere there in the briefing notes said to him, "Your manager will be meeting you later in the green room." And he looked back at me and said, "But I haven't got a manager." And I just grinned. And the programme was 2.5 hours long. He was a sofa guest, which meant he was off and on the set the whole time. And so I was so exhausted and confused. Every time I saw him, and I brought somebody to the green room, I'd see him and I'd go, "Your manager will be here in a minute." And he'd go, "I haven't got a manager." And eventually some bloke showed up and I ushered him into the green room and I went, "Your manager's here." And they both burst into hilarious laughter as though I'd cracked some sort of funny joke, but clearly the joke was on me.
Gaby,
Yep.
between your images, could we go back to seeing you?
Yeah, sure. They've nearly finished anyway, so I will. Oh, I know how to do that.
If you know how to.
Stop share. So now I am freelance, but I have a regular gig running a show presented by 3 broadcast legends, and I'll go back to the screen quickly because I think you know who they are. Sorry, right, yeah. Angela, there's another one, me with Angela in Bath on location. And but, you know, I feel as though I've worked with some real broadcasting legends and, you know, presenters as well as producers. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to share this again because, I mean, some of you who have long memories will remember at least 2 of these people. So I don't know if you remember Philip Tibenham, who was a Panorama reporter who I did some work with, and he was, you know, from old school and just like a really fantastic reporter. And Glyn Worsnip, who was hilarious, and, you know, he taught me such a lot. He kind of basically made the film for me. And sorry, the other one is, none of you will know, but my late friend Jerry, who was my mentor and guide, and she was the deputy editor of Watchdog. And I miss her every time I go to work. So I'll stop that for a minute. But I just want to move on to some serious stuff, because I would like to actually move on to your questions. But first, I am going to say that the BBC is at a crossroads, and that is a phrase that you could have legitimately said, I think, at any time in the past 40 years. I mean, there's always seems to be, as long as I can remember, there's a crisis about the licence fee or the political bias or something. But recently, I got particularly communally enraged when the editor of the Jewish Chronicle repeatedly tweeted what an outrage it is that the BBC is apparently considering axing the television channel BBC4. And I replied to him twice, and he simply ignored me. You know, what is the BBC supposed to do? I am still, and I will always be, in awe of what the BBC achieves. Not my own, to be honest, modest contribution in the scale of things, but the vast and wonderful output. I don't have to start listening it, you know, Blue Planet, etc., etc. You all know what it is, and I think we take it for granted at our peril. Broadcasting is still one of the few things in which Britain is a world leader. And it doesn't come easily or naturally. And I think, to me, I have a sort of visual image of the BBC as a kind of tent post, holding up the entire edifice of our television and radio industry, and setting standards in things like broadcast ethics and health and safety, as well as production quality, that other channels and broadcasters follow. I mean, we have a department called editorial policy. I have never, whenever I've worked for independent channels and independent production companies, they've never properly understood editorial policy, and they don't. When I'm in the BBC, I can just pick up the phone to a woman called Sue Pennington and say, Sue, what should I do in this situation? What is the right thing to do? I'll give you an example. We just made some films with Tommy Walsh, who some of you will remember from Ground Force, and he had an accident while we were filming him. And so we had a real issue. Do we say that he's had an accident, or do we just carry on as though he hasn't had an accident? And, you know, there's always a big question that hangs over all broadcasters, particularly the BBC, as my friend Jerry, who I just mentioned, always said to me, Gaby, what would it look like in the sun? And that is, you've got to have that in your head the whole time. So it doesn't mean that the BBC is always right. Of course it isn't. Or it's not always first, it's not always best. But some of the criticism that's sometimes levelled at the BBC is just grossly unfair. And I'll cite one example which makes me furious, which is the misogynistic hate campaign that is being waged against the BBC's first ever female political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. You know, I just get furious, you know, about it. What male political editor has had to face such criticism? So coming back to BBC4 and to put it in some kind of context, as of this year, the BBC is for the first time expected to meet the cost of free licenses for the over 75s. And I'm going to go back to my, it probably won't enlighten you much, but right. The cost of that is £745 million.
Wow. And
that's a fifth of the corporation's budget. So if you remember, there's been this huge outcry at the decision by the corporation to make over 75s pay their licence fee, apart from people on pension credit. But even that will cost 250 million. And to give you some kind of context, the entire budget for BBC4 is 54 million. So, I mean, I would say, looking at the history of this, free licenses were originally met in full by the government under a policy originally introduced by Gordon Brown in 1999. If you're angry at the fact this is being discontinued, and, you know, feel free to be angry about it, obviously, but direct your ire at the UK government of Boris Johnson, not at the BBC. It's just not fair. Or if you feel as though free licenses for the over 75s are something the BBC must pay for, then accept that channels and services will have to go. They will have to be slashed. You know, there's a kind of idea that we're all magicians, that because presenters earn lots of money, that somehow the BBC's awash with cash. I can tell you, you know, if we go to a meeting, we're not even allowed to have croissants anymore. So, I mean, you know, and you don't have to have a very long memory to recall that in 2010, the government also shifted the £245 million annual cost of the World Service onto the BBC, which had been met by the Foreign Office. So, you know, we get very used to all the things the BBC does. Not everything can be explained by overpaid presenters. And I mean, I'll give you an example. So I work on Rip Off Britain Holidays, and we shoot the link parts of it in Tenerife. Well, our Facebook page is full of people going, why don't you shoot this in London? This is a ridiculous, why am I paying for 3 rich pensioners to go to Tenerife on a holiday? And I'll tell you for now, I mean, I have arguments with my boss, Rob, about, because I am not allowed to say the truth to people about this. And they go, why can't you just do it in a studio in London? A studio in London, nothing's free anymore. The BBC doesn't own all these facilities. A studio in London would have to be paid for and would cost more than going to Tenerife, frankly. Tenerife's cheap. And they travel budget, and Gloria's husband goes too, he pays his own way. So people think that somehow, if there's a cheap solution, you know, that we should film it in Salford, where is our production base. But the ladies, as we call them, do not live in Salford, so they then have to stay in the Holiday Inn in Salford. Well, you can imagine how much that costs. So people like to criticise BBC, but the programme I make, including links in Tenerife, swear you all to secrecy. Well, the budget's something like £45,000 an episode. I mean, you'll be hard pushed to, you know, drama's £1 million. £1 million an episode or a minute, I can't remember which, but anyway, you know, drama's a lot more. And people who watch EastEnders, basically, shouldn't criticise my programme for sending ladies to Tenerife, but they do. Anyway, I won't go on much longer. I think you've all probably got some questions to ask, but I will point out that the BBC is not the sort of megalith it once was. You know, I work for BBC Studios. It's a kind of completely sort of, it's a semi-autonomous organisation. We make programmes for all sorts of people, and the vast majority of the programmes you watch on the BBC are made by the BBC. Watch the end credits. They're made by independent production companies. It's all been broken up by the Tories. What can I say? Ask questions.
Thank you so much, Gaby. Well, one thing that clearly comes out of all this is how much you depend on teamwork. And it takes a lot of people to make the programs and for people to cooperate. So one of the questions that I would like to start with on this subject before we move maybe to some of the other things you've been involved with, like writing, what's it like? I know there are lots of women in television, but when you started out, were there problems with sexism? How were you treated as a Jew? Did that enter it at all, or did you just keep your personal identity more to yourself? Those kind of issues working.
Yeah, well, I've never hidden my Jewish identity. I mean, it's interesting because when I arrived in Leeds, as you can imagine, it was a very male-dominated, and it was a newsroom, and all those places were very male-dominated at the time. And in fact, the man who interviewed me and whose behaviour I described initially, he was having an affair with his, you know, production secretary, and everybody knew about it. It was sort of blatant, and they were quite dismissive towards me, and sort of said I should go back to Hampstead, sort of thing. And I kind of went, I'm not from Hampstead, you know, I'm Welsh. And because of the way I looked, they made a lot of sort of quite sweeping assumptions about what I was capable of. And there was a bit of, I was the representative of London, as you can imagine. In Yorkshire, that didn't go down too well. I mean, direct sexism, I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to put your finger on it. You know, I think I've been very aware through my career of the rise of the women. Television now is pretty much a female-dominated industry. I mean, you have to go back 20 years to have the first female controller of BBC One and BBC Two. So many execs, and my execs are female. So many of the kind of people who run things, channels, you know, they're women.
And what about your Jewish identity? How did that come into things?
I think people, I mean, I always joke, you know, I always sort of tell jokes about, not jokes, but, you know, we always have a bit of a laugh about what a nightmare Passover is and stuff like that, you know, trying to explain the intricacies of our kind of strange way of life to other people. I don't think I've ever been aware of being picked out, you know, being the target of anti-Semitism. But you don't know, because, you know, that kind of thing's sort of behind your back, isn't it? I don't think people would be overt about it.
Was there a positive way in which your Jewish identity entered into your...
Well, I suppose I would pick on one thing. I mean, why do they choose me to do Holocaust Memorial Day? I didn't ask to do it. I think there was an assumption that I would know my way around the territory. And initially I was quite annoyed about it, actually. And also because it was on a Saturday night. So basically, anybody who worked on it couldn't be an observant Jew. I mean, it was simple as that. So, and I had various people, cantors and, you know, people. I mean, the whole idea the Home Office had was that it was very you know, it wasn't just about the Nazi Holocaust, it was about Cambodia, it was about, you know, it was about Rwanda. It was really, I mean, it was really fantastic from that point of view. They specifically told me they wanted a multi-ethnic youth choir, which wasn't that easy to find. But I also got a Rwandan band over, which I found a Rwandan band in Belgium, who we brought over for the day, which was fantastic. They were brilliant. She was called Cecile Kayerebwa and her band, and they were absolutely marvellous. Yeah, no, it slightly irked me that, because I got a fantastic cantor whose name I've forgotten now, and you know, he had a cantorial choir with him to sing Al Male Rachamim, but they had to cut. I was in 2s and 3s because, you know, they had to wait for Shabbat to go out before they could leave home. Yeah,
that wouldn't happen today, would it? They wouldn't do it on a Saturday evening today.
Well, they waited for Shabbat to go out. It was on January the 27th, so Shabbat went out at about 4 or something, and they got in a cab.
Right.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Who'd like to ask a question?
Judith Morgan.
Okay, unmute yourself.
Hi, Gabby.
Hi, Judith.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. You mentioned Crime Watch. I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that, whether or not you felt traumatized by some of the horrible things that you came across.
Yeah, some of the things were really creepy. Actually, I'll tell you the worst one. And I think my exec knew when I commissioned this that it was going to be, I don't know, I think I had a moment where I sort of didn't quite visualize the film before I saw it. And it was, do you remember there was a series of rapes of elderly women in their homes, of sort of stranger rapes where he'd cut the electrics or something and break into the house and rape elderly ladies? Oh, the way it used to work, now it's all done remotely, but the way it used to work is you'd commission the film, and then on a certain day you'd go into the cutting rooms and view the film that you wanted made. And I just felt my heart going to I thought, I commissioned this, it's absolutely horrifying. But, you know, we put it, you know, we were brave and we put it out, and eventually they caught him. But that was quite hard. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, from having read Retribution,
yeah,
some of your experience of real life happenings in your writing as well. Maybe.
Yeah. It did. I mean, I think what I put into the book was a slight feeling, I think, that any thinking producer would have, that there's something slightly uncomfortable about making entertainment out of other people's misery. You know, I mean, on the one hand, you do want to, you know, I've always been interested in social affairs and, you know, had a social conscience and enjoyed making those sort of programs. But I mean, Crime Watch, actually, you probably don't realise it, but there's lots of quite strict rules to stop it being, you know, sensationalised. So, for example, they're not allowed to use, well, it's obviously not, doesn't exist anymore, but we weren't allowed to use any incidental music, for example, because it was considered that incidental music was a sort of film device that would just ramp up the tension. But directors always found a way around that. People were always driving around in cars with the radio on and stuff like that, you know. So I mean, the trouble is that, you know, people have a creative drive as well, so they get around things a bit. But, you know, there were quite strict rules on Crime Watch about what you could and couldn't show and how you would build your, you know, they didn't want it to be too sensationalist. They wanted it to be a genuine public service.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Margaret?
A couple of things. I was on the Home Office committee which was planning the Holocaust Memorial Day.
I remember it well.
And everyone on the committee was so thrilled with how you created that first Holocaust Memorial Day. It was a triumph, and it was so sensitively done. It was a huge success. So bravo. How do you think that your English degree, how has your English degree influenced what you have done later? Have you consciously sort of thought back very much to what you learnt at Sussex in any way?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, obviously I've always liked writing. When I was at university, way before everybody else, I had a typewriter and I typed all my essays, and I loved that. I taught myself to touch type in my school holidays when I was about 12, and I loved that feeling of I don't write with a fountain pen well or with a pen. I really like writing, you know, it's very instinctive. But I don't know. I mean, I'd quite like to do my English degree again, actually. But actually, one very good thing about Sussex then, and I think they've changed this very, very sadly. So Sussex had pioneered interdisciplinary education, and so you didn't just do the canon of English literature. You did a lot of contextual studies. And my school was English and American, and so I had done contextual courses in Black Americans and in feminism in England, and you know, so those, I suppose, that sort of broader social awareness that I got from the courses I'd done was really helpful. But I think I felt actually that as a journalist, it was really helpful having, you know, studied in that way and done things like they had this kind of course people always used to joke about, modern European mind. Well, you know, the joke was that they would equip you for a cocktail party, that you know, you had enough things to say about Kierkegaard or Nietzsche to just have a sort of, you know, superficial conversation about them. But I sort of, when I came to write, and I began to feel as though my textual analysis of the English texts was lacking. And that's what I felt when I came, you know, back to the literature side of it. I didn't feel that I had a good enough. And also seeing my own daughter, you know, Rivka did English at Cambridge, and I felt as though the depth and complexity in which the English was studied was, you know, on a different level, really.
I see from the notes at the side that Wendy Skolnick also went to Sussex and really appreciated the contextual approach.
Oh, that's interesting.
Do you want to add anything, Wendy? Wherever you are.
Wendy's a little bit younger than me.
I don't think so, Gabby. I think you might find you're a bit younger than me, but let's
76 to 79.
75 to 79.
Oh gosh, we were there at the same time, Wendy.
Ah.
Yeah, I think I had this conversation with Stephen once.
Oh yeah,
we have a large amount of
were you in
Sussex
Euro?
alumni at Shul.
Were you in Euro?
Euro, yeah.
Yes, you look like a Euro person to me.
Oh, there you go.
We can't see you, Wendy. You're.
Oh no, that's because I've been moving around, and I thought it would give everybody see. I was doing a few chores.
Okay.
There's nothing worse on a Zoom call than seeing people flitting in and out of shot.
I'll tell you a secret. I did a Zoom, 4 hours of Zoom last night. It was a limud based in New York. It was fantastic, but I couldn't sit still for 4 hours. So I was busy oil painting during one of the sessions, and the speaker said, "It's fascinating to watch you oil painting." Didn't occur to me anybody could see what I was up to. Anyway, that's an aside. I also, in the messages, Lydia wondered if she could give an example of something that happened to her when she worked for BBC Radio. Is that okay?
Yeah, please do. I mean, I'd love to hear what you all think about, Jews obviously have, as a community, we have a particular take on the BBC, and I have to, put my hands up. I am very split on that. I change my opinions, but Lydia.
Hello.
Hello.
I used to be a writer for Weekending.
Oh, how brilliant.
It was the worst 2 years of my life.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that comedy for you, though? Is it the world of...
Well, most comedians are, as you probably know, most comedians are the most depressive bunch of suicidal neurotics you could not wish to meet in your life. So there was quite a bunch of the team I worked with. I think there were about 15, and 4 of them managed to kill themselves.
Oh my goodness.
One of them had anorexia, Debbie Barham. She was a brilliant writer, but, one drank himself to death and 2 actually killed themselves. The pressure was very bad, but I do remember the pressure on me was particularly tough. And this was in the early 90s. And I got it for being for being female, for being middle-aged, and for being Jewish. I mean, I couldn't have committed a more egregious series of crimes. But I remember one incident where one of the producers sat us down in the script meeting on Wednesday afternoon, and she said, "Right, well, the Israelis have executed 160 Palestinians in the past 6 months," or whatever it was, "and I want you all to write something on this." And I said, what do you mean executed? There isn't a death sentence in Israel. Are you sure you're not talking about, this was during the Intifada? I mean, it was, those guys kept coming in and shooting up buses and stuff like that, and she was tallying those up. Are you sure it wasn't, that sort of thing? And she said, "It doesn't matter. I want you all to write that script." And she ended up, we all wrote various scripts on it. And the one that got through was incredibly anti-Semitic. So that was on the Friday. On the Monday, I saw her. And I said I wanted to talk to her about it. And I said, "It's about that script on the Friday night's broadcast." And she said, "Oh, I thought it would be from you." And then I said, "I didn't think it was very fair." And she said, "Oh, why do you people always get so angry when Israel's mentioned?" And that was just about the tone of everything in the light entertainment department of radio.
Do you have anything along those lines, Gabby?
I've never done foreign affairs, so you know, I mean, apart from Holocaust Memorial Day, I'm trying to think if I have ever done anything. You know, I think I'd find it challenging, but no, I've never. You know, I've never been a news person, so I've never had to consider that. And I think, you know, it's very difficult. I mean, news is obviously a bit of a sort of separate part of the BBC. It's got its own culture and its own outlook. But when people accuse the BBC of being very anti-Israel, which, you know, I really have got opinions on it, but, you know, as I said, they change. Overall, you know, I think the BBC does a fantastic job of reflecting the Jewish community. I'm
Deborah,
afraid.
you had a question.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
There's going to be a new BBC Director General. Do they set the tone for the BBC, or is it just an administrative sort of job?
They can do quite a lot. I mean, I've obviously experienced quite a few Directors General. I remember Tony Hall when he was, when I mentioned 60 Minutes programme I worked on, he was one of the editors of the day, as was Mark Thompson. So I do know those people. And the one who made the biggest impression on me was Greg Dyke, because he was so, he's so much for producers and the staff, and he did so much for the staff. He put such a positive tone. He discovered how many people were on contract, and he got everybody on, you know, as many people as possible onto the staff. And that's when I joined the staff of the BBC, when Greg was the Director General. And also, now my memory, I'm having a senior moment, but the Director General before Greg Dyke was John Burt, just come back. And yet again, he had quite an, you know, he did set the tone a lot on journalism, because he was a journalist, John Burt. And he had this very, he insisted on things being done in a certain way, and which were good in some ways, actually, you know, but it was a bit robotic. So, yeah, I think, I mean, Directors General do set the tone. I mean, Tony Hall, I would say, because he's a bit of an emergent, because he wasn't really supposed to be the Director General, was he? It was supposed to be the bloke who lost his, who was Director General for about a month before the Jimmy Savile thing all blew up in his face, which is probably a little bit unfair, but Tony Hall always struck, I mean, this is very personal, but I always remember him on 60 Minutes always calling everybody matey, and there's something sort of quite quite friendly and quite nice about, but sort of not particularly, I can't say what his style is for the BBC. I mean, he's obviously dropped a clanger by, you know, letting the government make us pick up the cost of the licence fee for the over 75s. And that was him. So, yeah, they do have a huge impact on your work.
Deborah has a question.
Yes, you mentioned, that you were split about BBC bias.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about in what way you are split?
Well, I suppose the thing is, as a BBC producer, you know, we have a set of editorial guidelines which we are held, you know, I know every word of what I write as a script gets pored over for bias, for all sorts of things. You know, you wouldn't believe what level of detail we go into and how many different hands it goes through, even a script for a daytime programme like Little Britain. And how much consultation there is about it. So I suppose it seems odd to me that when it comes to news, that if the bias is that obvious, it would be allowed to go through. But on the other hand, you know, I do see things that I find it feels as though the other, you know, the Israeli side is sometimes not being stated as clearly as it could be, or as much context, you know. But the trouble with news is they have 2 minutes, you know, how much context can you give? Yeah, you know, I feel it both ways.
But you don't have a voice in any of this, really.
I'm completely outside it. You know, I make consumer programmes for BBC One Daytime. I mean, I've just done Health Check UK, which was a fantastic programme to be involved in. And I don't know if any of you watched it, but
Yeah, very good. Really enjoyed it.
I mean, it was a breath of fresh air, and it was a real interesting to see how it all came together. I was responsible for the videotape items on it and got the series producer credit. But you know, how to see only the BBC could make a programme like that in a crisis. I don't think any other organisation would do it.
Yeah.
And you know, you should honestly, if you want to read something that shows you how important the BBC is to people, go onto the Health Check UK live Facebook page and read the comments from the people. And there are hundreds of them, and they all say the same sort of thing. And they go, "I'm so sad this programme's going off air. It's making this lockdown work, you know, survivable for me. It's a breath of fresh air. I love Mr. Motivator." I mean, one after another, you know, there are just so many positive reactions. And I
Why is
really
it going off? Why is it ending?
I think the feeling was that we've said all there is to say, really, about, you know, how many more things can we say about lockdown and coronavirus. And I think it was quite expensive to make as well. That's the truth. It cost a lot more. I mean, a live programme costs a lot more than, say, a recorded,
Sorry, can I just come in on the about the BBC? I think we don't realise what a wonderful resource we have in the BBC, and the fact that it is independent of government and to a large extent independent of, well, totally independent of advertisers, and therefore a bit cushioned. And I think that in terms of balance or fairness are two different things. But I think that, like the United Nations, it's the sum of its parts. So you get the Middle Eastern correspondent, who at the moment I think is very pro-Arab, and then years ago, in the 6-Day War, we had the BBC had the only correspondent who was working from Jerusalem, who was the only one who was telling the truth about what was going on. So it's the sum of the people who are there, like every other organisation. But I think we really, really would be in a terrible state if we lost an independent BBC. And you only have to look at other nations, for example, the American television programs, to notice how wonderful our BBC is.
For me, the strength of the BBC is that it's so across the board. You know, I mean, obviously on Netflix there's some great stuff, but they don't do a service of, you know, if you look at the sort of comprehensive kind of sweep that the BBC offers. And yeah, it is easy to, you know, it's obviously not perfect, and they do drop clangers quite frequently. And you know, I think that whole thing, as you say, you know, I think it is troubling. The whole coverage of Israel is difficult. But then sometimes, did anybody see the Michael Portillo? You know, I used to work on Michael Portillo's Great Railway Journeys, and they did Israel, and it was really good.
Yeah,
because it wasn't done by news, and it was scrupulously balanced.
But I always think it's funny that after any reference to the Middle East, that both sides cry prejudice and bias, that you get the pro-Palestinians saying that was a Zionist conspiracy, and the Jews saying that was a very pro-Arab piece of work. So I think the BBC can't do right.
And I think there's probably a tendency to say, well, if they're both complaining, we must be getting it more or less right. You know, so it is one of those. That is a very difficult thing. But I think as far as experiencing anti-Semitism, it's very. I mean, Lydia, what you experience is very, interesting. but it feels to me, well, one is it's obviously like 30 years ago. If it was in the 1990s,
Yeah.
I think people will be much more careful nowadays about expressing that kind of bias.
Yeah, but probably, but they still think that, and the
Maybe.
How do you know?
producer about whom I am talking is now further up the greasy pole, you know, so with her brain, she's still there thinking those thoughts. So
You know that.
if you'd come across anything like that, Gaby.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I think it's, yeah, I genuinely, probably, you know, when I've gone to bed tonight, I'll think of something, but I haven't been aware of it. Doesn't mean it wasn't there, but I haven't been aware of it.
I was wondering if other people would like Gaby to talk a bit about writing, and I don't know how many of you were at the Top of the Hill talk. I wasn't, and I haven't yet had a chance to read your book, which I'm sure we can arrange to buy through you. But if others would like for you to talk about writing in general, or when you did it while you're working, how you fitted it in, how it started, any of that, would that be something?
Well, I'd like to know if anybody else has, you know, got heart-bringing ambitions to write a book, because so many people seem to want to, and it's hard to start. It's hard to.
That was the hardest thing for you, starting?
Well, to be honest, it wasn't really, because I took redundancy from the BBC in 2008 and used the money to pay for a master's degree in creative writing.
Oh.
So it was an expensive choice, because I didn't get back into television for probably about 4 years, during which time Steve made his film. So I couldn't have worked probably, because the children were still quite young. But I used that time to write the book. And I'm not sure I would have managed it otherwise, actually. But I still think, I think I probably manage it better now that the children, you know, obviously when you've got young children, it's really tricky.
Well, I have a question. Do you think lockdown is a good time for creative work, or does the shock and the isolation make it harder? What do you?
No, I think it's a great time, and I haven't started yet, but I am going to. I mean, I've just had a week off after finishing Health Check, and I'm doing my household chores and my little bits of DIY, and I'm getting myself ready to go back into the writing mode, because I think lockdown's a perfect time, because you've got fewer distractions and you can't think, oh, I'll go shopping, or I'll do something else, or I'll meet somebody for coffee. You can't do any of those things that I would normally you know, use as an excuse not to start writing. So I think it's perfect.
Any more writing questions for Gaby, or anything about the book? Can you tell us one thing that I was wondering is, how much was the inspiration for the book your own personal story? It's to do with, as I understand it, not having read it, to do with the trauma of somebody who's survived the Holocaust in hiding and other awful things, which have an effect on her, and then obviously on her family. And there's a lot of understanding and forgiveness that's needed, both for the perpetrator and the people who suffer later. Would you say?
Yeah, no, well, so the main character in the book is very much inspired by my mother. I mean, members of my family have said, where's the fiction part, Gaby? So my mother was quite an interesting character. I mean, she was Hungarian, she was very voluble and had a bit of a drink problem. And I mean, I suppose she died quite young, and so she was 69, and she basically died of alcohol poisoning, you know, long-term overuse of alcohol and cigarettes. I mean, obviously, since she's died, I mean, I do bear a big burden of guilt over her death and over her our relationship prior to her death. But when I was doing my course and we got to the point where we actually had to start writing, I remember Jonathan Myerson said to us, write about what you know. You don't want to spend the next 6 months doing research. And that is a tip, everybody. So, and as he said that, you know, it was a real light bulb moment. And I thought, the one person I know is my mother. And I don't think I could create a totally fictional character that would be as unique and fascinating and different as her. Because she was quite you'd never forget her if you met her. I mean, she was a very beautiful young woman, and I've got the photographs to prove it. She was a Hungarian refugee, so she, you know, she endured, I don't really know what she endured, but I know she hid during the Holocaust. I mean, Hungary, if anybody knows the story of the Holocaust in Hungary, it was pretty brutal. It was, the Hungarians were allies of the Germans, so they had their own fascist regime. But just before the end of the war, I think there was some suspicion, I can't remember if it was a suspicion or there was actual evidence for this, that they were going to do a unilateral peace treaty, and so Hitler sent in Eichmann, and Eichmann liquidated 75% of Hungarian Jewry within about 6 months. And the only ones who survived, so, you know, I'm very lucky that my mother survived at all. And then she, as she said, you know, then after the Nazis came, they thought everything was going to get better again, but then the Russians arrived and things got a lot worse again. So she had endured a lot, and then she arrived, when she arrived in the UK, she was, what year was it, 1950, she was 20. And she met my father and married him. But, you know, she had a lot of issues. And I decided to write about those issues because, I mean, they would, you know, it was a kind of black humour, really, if you write about them in retrospect. Because I was often, as a young teen, I was often picking up the pieces after my mother had kind of collapsed on the floor in a heap somewhere. But, you know, I suppose, actually, it's interesting because it takes me back to the whole Holocaust Memorial Day thing. Because, when, as Margaret was saying, you know, we did have some fantastic participants in the Holocaust Memorial Day, and Margaret knows probably as well as I do, you know, some of them, you know, like Ben Helfgott and people like that, who, you, yet again, you'd never forget him. He's just quite a character. But you know, I was always struck by these people like, and Elizabeth Pollock, who was also one of our, in 2005, they're so dignified. They're so, you know, they've been through such a lot, and they've got this sort of real air of nobility about them, I feel, when I meet a Holocaust survivor like that. And then I had my mother, who did have a kind of, she had a very patrician air about her, there's no doubt about it, but very, I could, you know, because I lived with her, you know, I knew that it was all everything, she had a sort of superficial air about her, but underneath she was just a gibbering mess. And that was, you know, and a lot of things went through my head because of that. So one is that obviously she'd suffered a lot of trauma during the Holocaust and during the Russian invasion, which she did cause a lot of damage. But she also had pretty nasty parents, you know. I mean, they were very Victorian. They weren't touchy-feely people or very loving people. They didn't show their affection very much. And I basically came to it with a feeling, because when you read, I mean, I now have read a huge number of Holocaust memoirs, and, you know, people who lose their mothers at an early age for a very good reason say, you know, that their mother was the perfect mother and very maternal and this great filibuster, you know, managing everything. But if your mother survives, then you have to live with all that trauma. And, you know, I believe very firmly that family dysfunction happened before, during and after the Holocaust. And I've got the evidence. So you've got to think about that as well, that, you know, families weren't perfect before. And then they had, on top of that, all this massive trauma of what happened to them, these terrible life experiences. So I'm just going to put them like these terrible life experiences. So it's a toxic combination, really. And in my mother's case, you know, she actually used to go to when we lived in Cardiff, my mother went to London twice a week to see a psychotherapist, and had 2 sessions on each. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of psychotherapy. I still don't know if she actually told her psychotherapist she had a drink problem. So there was a lot to write about. And I've got more, because my dad's family is very interesting as well. You see, the thing is about writing is, the conclusion I came to after thinking about it is that, in a way, it's very similar to writing a book. It's very similar to making a film. But in the case of writing a book, for me, I mean, most of my books totally made up. Yeah, the characters and some of the incidents are real, or happen to me in some way, shape or form. But the actual structure, most of the actual content is total fiction. It's, you know, I had to make it up. But if you have these scenes in your mind, they're like the sort of rushes of your film, and you can piece them together with bits that you make up and create a plot and create a narrative arc that goes through it. But really, your mind has retained so much, and you can use all that material as building blocks.
I seem to remember that you have had an uncle or a great uncle who was a brilliant painter, and some of his paintings are shown at the Ben Uri Gallery.
Yes.
Do you think you might write about him?
That's a good idea, actually. I mean, he comes into it. I mean, basically, I suppose my next book I want to write is about my father's side of the family. So my Uncle Heinz, who you referred to, was my father's stepbrother. So my grandmother, who, there's a sort of like, to me, this sort of great sort of contradiction living within my family, that my grandmother was very much kind of worshipped as the perfect grandmother. She had the white hair, she was very dignified, she was gorgeous and everything. She actually abandoned her own kids to run off with a lover. And I didn't realise that properly, because I just didn't believe it. I had been told it when I was younger, and I thought it just seemed incredible. So she left my paternal grandfather and ran off with this other man whose name I still carry, Joachim Koppel. And so there's a bit of a story there. It's a love story. It's a story of family dysfunction and, you know, merged families. And there's lots of strange things that went on. So so Heinz and my biological aunt, Illa, had an affair when she was under 16 that was perfectly tolerated by the family. They seemed to think it was okay, and I think there was actual relations involved. And he, you know, Heinz was quite a lot older than my aunt, so really that's quite odd if you think about it. And I think they thought of themselves as being quite bohemian, you know, sort of, they liked Freudian psychotherapy, they were quite, but it's very difficult to sort of work out how they all thought that was okay. But anyway, I shall be exploring that in a future book, I hope.
Do you find it cathartic then to write, like writing that first book? Did it change your feelings towards your mother?
It did change my feelings towards my mother, and I did find it cathartic. But actually, the thing is, I think we've all got these things in our families, and I think if if you're looking for material for a novel, look, just investigate your own family first, and I think you might find really interesting things. It doesn't mean you have to write it as a historical fiction. You can transfer the dynamics and the relationship and the characters into a different time frame. But all families, I guarantee you, have got dysfunctional, interesting, intriguing relationships in them. And yours will too.
I thought it was only my family.
Oh, you know, my husband's just become a psychotherapist. We've got to keep them in business, haven't we?
Right. And did you find your sympathy for your mother increased after she was no longer there? That you...
Yeah. Look, a lot of people, I think part of it was after my mother died, I kind of I did feel guilty about her. She was a very talented woman. She actually got into this country on a scholarship to the Guildhall School of Music. And she'd studied under world famous teachers in Budapest. And I've still got the letters. I've got them downstairs. Letters from the Guildhall School offering her the place, letters from the Guildhall School to the Home Office asking them to let her in. And after she died, I went round people and I said to them, what do you remember of my mother? And almost to a person, they all said the same thing. Oh, she meant well. So she was loved to do things for other people, but she also, you know, she used to ring them up when she was drunk. And I think that's what they remembered. They didn't remember the things that I remembered, that she was talented and clever and fantastically intelligent. Only one person, my cousin Ian, when it was Sarah's bat mitzvah, my middle daughter, he couldn't come, but he sent me a card. And I don't know why I think he wrote some reflections into the card. And he said, your mother was the most intelligent woman I ever met. And I just kind of burst into tears, really. I just thought, he's the only person who really understood her, because he liked to drink too. And he didn't condemn her for drinking. He thought she, you know, they could just have a drink together and sort out the world.
Wow. Powerful stuff. Any more questions? You're all very quiet suddenly.
I haven't got a question. I just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed listening to you, Gaby.
Oh, thank you.
It's been really, really, you know, interesting and meaningful, and it's really lovely to hear you talk about your family and all the dynamics that goes on, which, as you say, goes on in every family.
I do. I think that's what's brilliant about families in a way. I mean, yeah, obviously I love to watch, you know, sort of Little Women or something, and the family depicted as all being very quite, you know, basically quite perfect.
Yeah.
But actually, we've all got these fascinating things in our families, and that's what makes them absolutely amazing.
Absolutely.
We survive those dynamics.
Definitely.
Vivian echoes, I think, what we all feel, the appreciation that you've been so open with us.
Yeah, it's been lovely.
And I know for myself, my parents had their significant issues that made it hard to be the parent that I might have benefited from. And I remember always thinking I'm supposed to honor my father and my mother, but sometimes it's not easy. But then when they're not there, once they've both passed, I then have so much more compassion for them. I didn't plan it, but it just happens. I can now see things much more of why they were the way they were. And it's sort of, everybody's kind of, as you say, you're born into something and then other things happen and it's complicated. And
yeah. I mean, I do have a lot of regret, actually, that my mother didn't survive longer, you know, long enough for me to kind of, you know, my children were very young when she died. And so it's, you know, you're in a bit, not a crisis, but, you know, you haven't got any time really when you've got young children.
Yeah.
And, you know, every time we take the kids up to my mum's house, and we get there and she'd be drunk and I'd sort of lose my rag with her. And that's not a very good start. And I suppose now I regret it, really, that I didn't. I'd love to know more about what really happened to her during the war, because I've only ever had hints of it.
There were things written up in the reviews that I read.
Yeah, I mean, it's fiction. I mean, I made one interesting thing actually about the book is that so it starts with a scene of a shooting on the banks of the River Danube, which, you know, did used to happen. And in it, the protagonist's father is shot. Well, my grandfather was lined up to be shot on the banks of the River Danube, but he wasn't shot, he survived. And the reason he survived is that my mother, who was then a 14-year-old girl, knew that he had a mistress. And the mistress's husband was a black marketeer who was in with the Nazis. And my mother went to get this bloke, to get him to make a case for my grandfather's survival. And that sounds incredible. I just thought, I thought I would write that. And I actually thought, I'm not a good enough writer to make this sound credible. So he's going to die.
Wow.
So, you know, it's just, so, you know, I think my mother, what I do know is that she had to be the adult because my grandmother wasn't going to do that.
You actually bring me to something that I've been thinking about for years, that we get to a stage in our lives when we really wish that we had asked our parents or our grandparents questions, more questions, and everybody feels the same. Oh, I wish I'd asked more. And I wondered whether we couldn't do a shul project on this, obviously not at the moment, where we have maybe my grandchildren's age of teenagers asking their parents and their grandparents. I mean, nowadays grandparents are still alive and lively, unlike years ago when they were terribly, terribly old. And maybe we could have them ask it on a Sunday afternoon, asking their grandparents questions about what went on in their lives. And although, thank God, my generation didn't have the Holocaust situations, although I have to say that I was very lucky. I lost nobody in my family in the Holocaust because my family were on both sides were all here from the 1880s. But although a lot of people did have that, nowadays grandparents and great-grandparents who may be still alive lived through the Depression, lived through the 1950s, the 1960s, and maybe the grandchildren would like to ask the questions now, which in years to come, they'll be sorry they didn't ask.
Absolutely.
Yeah. 9/11. All sorts of things have happened, you know, in our generation.
Yes.
Great idea, Irene.
Very good idea. Fantastic.
Well, if anybody fancies picking it up, Beth.
Well, I think each of us could, if whoever wants to, could jot down some ideas and let's say email them to Irene or me or whoever, and we can start to see if something can develop. And I'm sure Gaby, as a producer, would be a great help on this.
We just got to think whether you wanted it on video, because, you know, is that going to be video, audio, or do you want to write it down and make a book? You know, what format? You know, we could.
I'm not professional, but it's just that I know the enormous sense of regret I have that I never asked my grandparents, with whom I was very close, and I spoke Yiddish with them and everything, but I never asked the things about their early lives that I now wish I had asked.
So when would they have been born, Irene?
They would have been born in about the 1870s, I suppose, because I was very much the baby of the family, and that's why I was the one who spoke to them and learned more of the family history than anybody else did in my family. But even so, huge gaps, and suggestions of stories of one man great uncle went to South Africa and ran off with a madam of a brothel. Well, why didn't I ever ask about that story? It's just a fantastic story.
It's brilliant. Yeah. And so were they always in this country? You said from 200 years they were in this. So where were they, in the East End or?
The East End, yeah. Where I grew up as well.
Oh,
My parents were most unusual. They lived in Brixton after they got married, which was a very respectable Jewish neighbourhood, and moved back to the East End when everybody else was moving out because they found it exciting and cosmopolitan.
Well, I think it was.
My parents were extraordinary.
Yeah. Wow. That's brilliant.
Well, you've inspired something here, Gaby, and I think our time is going to run out shortly. So before it does, we'd all like to say a very big thank you to you.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.